Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much for expediting this hearing. I think it's critical, as we talked yesterday, that we have this conversation. First off, I'd just like to acknowledge that North Dakota is very proud of the role that we play in developing technology and continuing. Senator Hoeven and I brag about this all the time, and you can see our names are prominently featured on this bill because we want this technology to be safe. And so we have great opportunities to expand and to develop what we need for border security, for homeland security, right in North Dakota and right here. And so I just want to submit for the record a statement by Nicholas Flom, who is the Executive Director of the Northern Plains Unmanned Aircraft Test Site System. Nick is a great leader on UAS, both in North Dakota and the nation, and he and the North Dakota Test Site, I think, bring an important perspective on counter UAS and how to best pursue this initiative. And so,
without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First off, you know, and it's always dangerous when you're reaching back in the file banks of your memory. But there were companies that developed these techniques overseas for the Department of Defense that came back. And there is a great example in Baltimore where a local agency deployed the same techniques and the same equipment that was used internationally. I don't know, are you familiar with the Baltimore experience, any of you? Well, that's a problem, right? Because this is something I know from listening to a podcast, but you guys should know it. And they ran into a number of privacy problems, but I think it's something, I think it was like a Radio Lab podcast or maybe Planet Money podcast, but they talked about tracking the criminal element in the city of Baltimore and using this technique, and we're able to basically deploy resources almost immediately to conflict points that were very helpful. And it goes to what Claire's talking about, which is, you know, how do we do this, you know, even beyond terrorism threats, even beyond mass casualty threats. These are techniques can be very helpful for pursuing safety within communities themselves. And so I would recommend you guys all get a hold of Baltimore. If it's not Baltimore, I know it's, I remember it's Baltimore, but get a hold of the other entities.
Yes, Senator, we are aware of that. That's a persistent surveillance component. It's a little slightly different from the counter component that I was
right, but they're
about.
using, I mean, there's no reason why a persistent couldn't actually catch a counterterrorism threat as well, right? I mean, if they're given the right intel.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I think that there's a great example of a public safety utilization of this technology. I want to continue the dialogue that Claire engaged you all in terms of technology. I think that we feel sometimes that we're always behind the eight ball. We're always trying to catch up to what the bad guys are doing or catch up to what's happening and understand the technology. How can we accelerate the development of this technology, especially as it relates to surveillance, kind of moving forward? And what are you doing to accelerate the development of this technology or evaluating products, as Claire has talked about, off the shelf that are already available? I'd start with you, Mr. Gladway.
Senator, thank you for the question. I think this legislation allows us the first step to start developing the lanes and the roads of what our authorities will be and how we can deploy it within the homeland. That is going to be unique from a law enforcement and how we use it and how we use that policy and legal framework. So when we have officers deployed at the border or at a national security event, that we have the parameters of what we can do and how we can deploy countermeasures. I'll turn it over to the Deputy Assistant Director of the FBI, who is really the subject matter expert on this and leaves that component down at SERG for a little more granularity on it.
Mr. Brenner?
Yes, Senator. We are working extensively with our private industry partners to evaluate what the market has out there in technology, and we're actually preparing ourselves for when the national airspace opens up, and I could turn that over to Ms. Stubblefield in a moment about that, but we want to be in a position to make the best use of this technology as possible. So we're coordinating with our private entity partners both on the operational surveillance side of the house and on the counter surveillance side of the house, counter UAS side of the house, in order to position ourselves and to provide the industry with what we potentially believe we might need to both surveil and counter. I'm sorry?
One of the things that I would remind you is that this is Homeland Security Committee, but also Government Affairs. And we're charged with efficiencies. We're charged with making sure that we are doing everything that we can to make sure that we're not wasting taxpayer dollars, that we're not recreating the wheel when the wheel's already been made available. And so just want to reiterate Claire's point, which is, you know, let's not think that the public fisc is open to every dollar that you think you may need. Let's try and economize on this. Mr.
Yes,
Brunner?
yes, ma'am. There's a National Capital Region or group that gets together on the federal level. It's chaired primarily by DHS and DOD, that the Department of Justice is now a partner to, looking at exactly that. How do we all believe in this technology. We all know that we're going to need certain components of this technology. Let's be smart about it. Let's do it together. Let's push all of our requirements out at one time so that we don't waste the taxpayers' money.
Yeah. Turning to Mr. Gladway, we are obviously very interested in providing border security on this committee. I think that we now have gone through a northern border study. We've gone through a southern border study. How engaged and involved are these technologies in the evaluation of that? How you know, we talk about a wall, but we can do a virtual wall if we do this correctly. And so we're very interested in how these technologies will be deployed at the border and whether you believe that you are paying enough attention to the development of these technologies as we look at border security strategies.
Senator, thank you for the question. I had the good fortune when I was the head of intelligence at U.S. Customs and Border Protection to actually help stand up the Northern Border Coordination Center in Detroit and actually brief you, I believe it was about 3 years ago. I'm very familiar with the unique environment of collection on the border using unmanned aerial vehicles. And we have done a tremendous amount of testing on the northern border. You're very familiar with the challenges with the foliage compared to the southern border. We have partnered with the Department of Defense and Intelligence Community at looking at capabilities and what we can deploy in an unclassified and classified meter to look at the coherent change of where those threats are. So if you're unlawfully entering and not going through a point of entry and declaring it, you're essentially illegally entering the United States. How are we deploying assets on that target to identify what that threat is? That's a layered approach with intelligence, not just air assets, but intelligence also in the rear law enforcement and in U.S. intelligence community assets and how we collect that. We're creating new systems in how to do that. This legislation, which also involves a strong research and development and reporting requirements to you, will allow us to show you that layered approach and how we're integrating in that intelligence from a classified and unclassified capability on the patrol aspect of it.
Yeah. And I think highlighting, Mr. Chairman, the importance of getting this legislation across the finish line so we can get started. Thank you so much.